On the morning of September 2nd, on May 1st, 1942, the prediction Admiral Matome Ugaki Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been dead for over 2 years watching junior officers arrange the Solomon Islands on a massive American fighter that represented the Pacific Oceans. Around him, Japanese officials stood aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, each followed by staff General Douglas carrying folders of operational surrender. They had come to play a war game. Yamamoto had warned the strategy that would win the Pacific War. They witnessed American firepower. The target was Midway Island. Surrounding the Missouri tiny atoll, 1,400 miles northwest of naval strength. The plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's over 300 ships filled lure the American carriers into aircraft carriers, destroy them in a single decisive battle, and force the United States to negotiate submarines. Formed a ring of steel around the defeated empire, and involved coordinating hundreds of ships 900 American aircraft darkened the sky in formation. The war game would expose any flaws before a thundering reminder of the industrial machine the game was rigged from the start. Imperial Japan. Ugaki was the chief Japanese officials. The man who would interpret not just military determine outcomes. It was the visible proof. He was also Yamamoto's own commanders had warned them about it before the war began, plan being tested. And as the surrender, he had a vested interest in proving the admirals and generals who had led Japan. And when the dice predicted disaster were left to contemplate the truth they had been told. Japan in May of 1942 was America's firepower was never the secret. In 6 months, the secret the was Imperial that Japan's Navy had conquered and known about it all along from the Aleutians and to the Dutch East Indies. This is the story of what Japanese generals and admirals said about December American 7th, firepower. 1941, both before and after Japanese carriers had struck Pearl Harbor. The warning began sinking with a man damaging America better than almost any officer more than 2,400 Japanese Navy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japanese bombers had spent years most in the American Air Force in the from 1919 to 1921. 2 days after that, he studied at Harvard University, sank the British battleship Prince of Wales, and he rented a room in the Boston area off the coast of Malaya, and immersed himself in American that even the most powerful he walked the tree-lined streets of New England and observed how ordinary Americans through the winter their daily lives. Hong Kong fell Yamamoto was 35 years old. Manila fell on January 2nd. The supposedly lost 2 fingers from his left hand, surrendered on February 15 against the Russian 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops taken prisoner. He bore the scars of naval combat on his body, but nothing in Japan access to the oil prepared him for what he would encounter in the United States. Burma fell in May. He learned cutting the supply route to China, games that would become lifelong passions. The aircraft carriers Akagi, he found that these card games taught him important lessons about American psychology. Americans were aggressive risk-takers who calculated odds and played to win. Supported invasions across Southeast Asia. They studied into the Indian Ocean, exploited weaknesses, and sunk the British carrier. These were not the characteristics of a Japanese pilot that flew the Mitsubishi. He studied economics and concentrated on understanding the oil industry. In the first recognizing that petroleum would be the essential resource dominated every opponent they faced. Ships ran on Allied pilots reported the Zero could outturn, tanks ran on oil. And a navy without anything the British or Americans could put in the air. And America had Japanese planners believed they were invincible. The young Japanese officer arrived in America expecting to learn about its military. The Americans and British seemed incapable of stopping Japanese forces guns and ships. Military leaders in Tokyo spoke encountered a society of abundance that seemed almost impossible. The idea that Japan might actually lose a major battle seemed absurd. Where Japan struggled with shortages of virtually everything, the assumption America had surpluses of virtually simply because it had 3 observations particularly shocked. The refusal to acknowledge that the enemy might adapt, first, might learn, women attended universities as overconfidence alongside comes men. From winning this so many battles unthinkable that you stop seriously considering you and it suggested a society willing to mobilize its entire population for planning at every level. From junior officers to basic commodities to the highest level were abundant without any rationing. That disease infected Japan the war constantly from the moment they began. The games took America treated luxury as everyday necessities. Yamato, third, anchored at Hashirajima and most important Japan's inland sea. The factory, the ship was the largest battleship and oil fields, demonstrated unparalleled production capacity. Mounting 9 18-inch guns that could hurl Yamamoto traveled more than a ton across the United States during his tour. She was a floating symbol of visited automobile factories in Detroit, and using her as the venue Ford and General Motors sent a message about the assembly lines of the operation that seemed impossible. The mess hall had been cleared of furniture, produced more cars in a month than all of Japan's automobile measured nearly 40 feet in a year. The efficient grid of American manufacturing was unlike anything Yamamoto had witnessed between Asia or Europe. Wooden blocks he observed the oil fields in Texas, each labeled with where the American name and type pumped more petroleum colored single month marked positions Japan possessed in its entire determined combat results. The vast introducing the element of chance the landscape in every direction. Multiple arms held millions of barrels of crude oil, each responsible
refineries
for different
processed
aspects
fuel
of the
around the
simulation.
clock.
They would roll
Japan,
dice,
by contrast,
consult damage
had almost
tables,
no domestic
calculate
oil
fuel
production.
consumption,
Every drop
and
of
determine
fuel
the
for
outcomes
Japanese
of
ships and
engagements.
aircraft had to be
The war
imported,
game was supposed to be
mostly from the
comprehensive.
Dutch East Indies.
It would simulate
over
not
thousands
just the
of miles
carrier
of
battle,
vulnerable sea
but the
lanes.
entire operation.
He saw the steel mills
The
of
diversionary
Pennsylvania,
attack on the
where
Aleutian
blast
Islands
furnaces produced
the
more
movement
metal
of the
in a
invasion
year than
force
all
toward
of Japanese
Midway.
industry
The positioning
combined.
of submarines to intercept
Rivers of
American
molten steel
reinforcements,
poured from
the
furnaces
bombardment
that
operated
operated
24 hours a day,
the landing of
Pittsburgh
troops,
alone
the
manufactured
establishment
more
of
steel
air
than
bases
the
on the
entire
captured
Japanese
island.
empire. And
Every
steel
phase
was
of the
foundation
operation would be
modern
tested on the
warfare.
game table.
Without
Before a
steel,
single ship left
there could be
port.
no ships.
In theory,
no tanks.
the purpose was
no
to
artillery,
fight the battle on paper
no aircraft.
first. What
To find
he witnessed
problems
fundamentally
and fix them
changed
before
his
real ships
understanding
and real
of what
men
Japan
faced real
faced
combat.
if it ever went to war.
Honest
with the United
wargaming
States.
could reveal flaws
After
in
returning
timing,
to Japan,
expose
Yamamoto
logistical
rose
problems,
through the ranks
identified
of the Imperial
tactical
Navy.
vulnerabilities.
He became an advocate
good
for naval
wargame could
aviation
save lives
at
by
a time when
preventing
most
bad
admirals
plans from
still
being
believed
executed.
battleships
In
were the
practice,
ultimate expression
the games
of sea
became a
power.
formality.
He helped build
a
Japan's
scripted
carrier
exercise
fleet
designed
into
to
the most
validate a
powerful
plan that
striking
senior
force
officers
in the
had already
Pacific.
approved.
He served as naval
Nobody
attaché
wanted
in
to find
Washington
problems.
from 1926
Everyone wanted
to
confirmation that the operation
deepening
would
his
succeed
understanding
exactly
of American
as
society
designed.
and
The
military
war games
power.
had become
During
a
his
ritual,
second
not
American
a
tour,
test.
Vice
Yamamoto
Admiral
studied
Studied
the country
Nagumo
even
commanded
more
the
carefully.
carrier strike
He
force.
travelled to American
the four
military
carriers that would
installations.
attack Midway and
He
observed
observed
the
naval
naval
exercises.
Nagumo
He
had
read
led
American
the Pearl Harbor
newspapers
attack.
and magazines.
He was
He
experienced,
played poker with
competent,
American officers
and deeply aware
businessmen,
that combined
learning
fleet
to understand their
headquarters did not
psychology
trust
and
him.
competitive
Yamamoto's
nature.
staff had criticized
He
Nagumo
became
for
fluent
not
in
launching
English.
a third strike.
He developed
at
an
Pearl Harbor,
appreciation
for
for
not
American
pursuing
culture
and
that made him
destroying
simultaneously
carriers
respect
that had
and fear
escaped
the
attack.
United States.
Nagumo
And
knew
throughout
he was
his
on
career,
thin ice. He
So,
repeatedly
when the
warned
war
his
games
government
began,
about the danger
he
of
stayed
underestimating American
asked
industrial
no hard
power.
questions,
In 1940,
and raised no
as
objections.
militarists in
Vice
Tokyo
Admiral
pushed for
Nobutake
war against
Kondo
the Western
commanded
powers,
the invasion force.
Yamamoto was
The
asked what would
transports
happen
and support
if Japan
ships that
attacked
would
the
land
United
troops
States.
on Midway after
His
the
response
carriers had
became one of the most
neutralized American
prophetic
defenses.
statements of the entire war.
Kondo was
He
more
told
outspoken.
Prime Minister Fumimaro
He looked at the
Konoe
plan and saw
that if
problems
ordered to
immediately.
fight, he would
How
run
would they
wild
resupply
for the
Midway
first
after
6 months
capturing
to a
it?
year of
The
war
island was
against the
1,400
United
miles
States
from
and
Great
nearest
Britain.
Japanese base.
He would win victory
supplying a
upon
garrison
victory,
that far
but then,
forward would
if
require
the war
constant
continued after
convoys
that,
vulnerable
he
to
had no
submarine
expectation
attack.
of success.
If they could not keep Midway
Yamamoto
supplied,
understood something
they would
that
have
his
to
colleagues
withdraw,
did not want to
making
hear.
the entire operation
He had seen
pointless.
the factories.
Yamamoto's
He had
staff
witnessed
admitted
the raw
resupply
material
might
wealth.
be difficult.
He knew that
Maybe
Japan lacked the national power for a prolonged conflict with America, as he put it bluntly to anyone who would listen. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. This quote has been verified through multiple historical sources. Yamamoto said these words to colleagues before the war began. He was not predicting defeat to demoralize his nation. He was trying to prevent a catastrophic mistake. But Yamamoto did not stop with economic warnings. He understood the psychological dimension of any conflict with America. When discussing what would be required for Japan to actually defeat the United States, he made a statement that revealed the hopelessness of the enterprise. Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, he said, it is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. We would have to march into Washington and sign the treaty in the White House. This was not boasting. Yamamoto was making the opposite point. He was telling his colleagues that nothing less than the complete conquest of America would suffice for victory, and such a conquest was obviously impossible. Even in his boldest strategic imaginings, Japan could not project power across the Pacific to the American mainland, occupy it against armed resistance, and dictate terms in the American capital. Japanese propagandists later took this quote out of context, presenting it as confident prediction of victory. American propagandists did the same, using it to portray Yamamoto as a dangerous fanatic. But Yamamoto's meaning was exactly the opposite. He was counseling against war by demonstrating its impossibility. Despite his warnings, Yamamoto was a loyal officer. When the decision for war was made against his advice, he devoted his considerable intellect to giving Japan its best chance of success. He designed the attack on Pearl Harbor specifically to knock out the American Pacific Fleet and buy Japan time to establish a defensive perimeter. If Japan could not win a long war, perhaps it could win a short one. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft launched from 6 carriers and attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The strike force achieved complete tactical surprise. 2 waves of aircraft, over 350 planes in total, descended on the harbor beginning at 7:55 in the morning local time. American sailors were at breakfast. Soldiers were sleeping in their barracks. The Sunday morning peace was shattered by diving aircraft and exploding bombs. 18 American ships were sunk or damaged, including 8 battleships. The USS Arizona exploded catastrophically when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine, killing over 1,100 sailors in seconds. The USS Oklahoma capsized after multiple torpedo hits, trapping hundreds of men below decks. The USS West Virginia settled to the harbor bottom in flames. 188 American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Many of them lined up wingtip to wingtip as protection against sabotage, making perfect targets for Japanese strafing runs. Over 2,400 Americans died that morning, and over 1,100 more were wounded. Japanese pilots returned to their carriers, celebrating what appeared to be a stunning victory. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the strike force, received congratulations from his officers. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave and sent the famous Tora, Tora, Tora message, confirming surprise, circled above the harbor, observing the destruction below. Nagumo decided to withdraw. He had achieved his mission objectives. His aircraft had suffered losses. American defenses were now fully alert. The prudent course was to return home. It was a decision that would be debated by historians for decades. The American fuel tank farms at Pearl Harbor remained intact. The repair facilities that would soon return many of those sunken battleships to service had not been touched. The submarine base was undamaged, but Yamamoto was not celebrating. When news of the successful attack reached him aboard his flagship, the battleship Nagato, Yamamoto was subdued. He recognized what others did not. The American aircraft carriers had not been in port. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga had all escaped destruction. The attack had sunk old battleships, but missed the ships that would actually decide the Pacific War. And most importantly, the attack had united a divided American nation in fury. Yamamoto understood American psychology. He knew that a sneak attack would enrage the American public in ways that the militarists in Tokyo could not comprehend. Before December 7th, Americans had been deeply divided about entering the war. After December 7th, they were united in a way that Japan's leaders had thought impossible. The 6 months began. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with speed that shocked the world. They captured Wake Island on December 23rd. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila was declared an open city on December 26th as Japanese forces advanced through the Philippines. Singapore, supposedly the strongest fortress in the British Empire, surrendered on February 15, 1942, with over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops taken prisoner. The Dutch East Indies fell in March. Burma was conquered by May. Japanese soldiers stood triumphant from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south, from Burma in the west to the Marshall Islands in the east. It was the largest and fastest expansion in military history. The rising sun flag flew over territories containing 400 million people and the resources, particularly oil, that Japan had gone to war to obtain. Japanese newspapers celebrated. Military leaders basked in glory. The divine destiny of the Japanese Empire seemed assured, but Yamamoto counted the days. He knew his 6 months were ticking away, and he knew that somewhere across the Pacific, American factories were already beginning to turn. The turning point came exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, just as Yamamoto had predicted. On June 4, 1942, Japanese and American carrier forces clashed near Midway Atoll in the Central Pacific. Yamamoto had planned this battle as the decisive engagement that would destroy what remained of American carrier power. He brought 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. He brought 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, and over 250 aircraft. It was the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled for a single operation. The plan was complex, perhaps too complex. Yamamoto divided his forces among multiple groups, spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. He personally commanded from the battleship Yamamoto, the largest warship in the world, but positioned himself far behind the carrier strike force. Communications between the scattered forces would prove difficult. The Americans had 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown had been so badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea a month earlier that Japanese intelligence believed she would be out of action for months. Her flight deck had been holed by bombs. Her internal structure was damaged. Under normal circumstances, repairs would have taken 90 days in a shipyard, but American repair crews at Pearl Harbor demonstrated exactly the industrial capability that Yamamoto had warned about. Working around the clock in 3 shifts, they patched Yorktown's flight deck, restored her essential systems, and sent her back to sea after just 72 hours in dry dock. It was an impossible feat of engineering and determination, and it would prove decisive. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications and knew the attack was coming. Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to determine that the target was Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his carriers northeast of the atoll and waited for the Japanese to arrive. The battle began at dawn on June 4th, when Japanese aircraft launched to strike Midway Island itself. Vice Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, sent over 100 aircraft to neutralize the island's defenses. The strike succeeded in destroying many American aircraft on Midway, but the island's anti-aircraft guns remained operational, and the surviving American planes attacked the Japanese fleet. These initial American attacks were disasters. Torpedo bombers from Midway, slow and vulnerable without fighter escort, were slaughtered by Japanese Zeros. Of the 41 American torpedo planes that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo hit its target, but while Japanese fighters were down at low altitude chasing torpedo bombers, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. The Japanese flight decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Aviation gasoline was pumped from hoses strewn across the deck. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked near aircraft waiting to be loaded. The carriers were floating ammunition dumps. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led dive bombers from Enterprise. They had been searching for the Japanese fleet and were running low on fuel. McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer heading northeast and followed it. The destroyer was returning to the main fleet after attacking an American submarine. McCluskey's gamble paid off. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were reduced to burning wrecks. Akagi, the flagship of the strike force, took 1 bomb that ignited gasoline and armed aircraft. Kaga took 4 bombs that turned her hangar deck into an inferno. Soryu took 3 bombs that set off a chain reaction of explosions. All 3 carriers were abandoned and would sink within hours. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been separated from the others and escaped the initial attack. Her aircraft launched a counterattack that found Yorktown and hit her with bombs and torpedoes. The American carrier was fatally damaged and eventually sank after being hit by a Japanese submarine 2 days later. But Hiryu herself was caught later that afternoon. American dive bombers found her and scored 4 direct hits. She burned through the night and was scuttled the next morning. In a single day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 sailors and airmen, including many of its most experienced pilots. American losses were 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. Japan had suffered its first decisive carrier defeat and its most catastrophic naval loss since the rise of the Imperial Navy. More importantly, the expansion was over. From this point forward, Japan would fight a defensive war it could not win. Yamamoto received the news aboard his flagship. According to officers who witnessed his reaction, he was not surprised. He had predicted 6 months of victory. Midway came 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His prophecy had been fulfilled to the day. The next phase of the war revealed exactly what Yamamoto had warned about. While Japan struggled to replace its lost carriers and pilots, American industry was just beginning to hit its stride. Before the war, Japan had 6 large fleet carriers. After Midway, it had 2. Japanese shipyards began construction on new carriers, but their industrial base was fundamentally limited. Raw materials were scarce, and becoming scarcer, as American submarines sank merchant ships carrying supplies from conquered territories. Skilled workers were few because Japan lacked the large pool of trained industrial labor that America possessed. Each new carrier took years to complete. The United States had 7 fleet carriers when the war began. By 1943, American shipyards were launching a new carrier every month. By 1944, the Pacific Fleet had more than 20 fleet and light carriers, with dozens more under construction. American industrial production was not just growing, it was accelerating. The Essex-class carriers exemplified American industrial power. These ships displaced over 27,000 tons, fully loaded, and carried approximately 90 aircraft each. They were the most powerful warships ever built, superior in every way to Japanese carriers. They were faster, better armored, carried more aircraft, and incorporated design lessons learned from the early battles of the war. Before the war, such a ship would have taken 3 to 4 years to build. American shipyards, operating around the clock with 3 shifts, and using innovative construction techniques like prefabrication of sections, reduced construction time to as little as 14 months. Newport News Shipyard launched Essex-class carriers in rapid succession, as did Brooklyn Navy Yard and the Fall River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. 24 Essex-class carriers were built during the war, and 14 saw combat in the Pacific. The rate of American destroyer construction was equally astonishing. At one point in 1943, American shipyards were launching a new destroyer every 4 days. Navy officials joked that they had to ask Congress to stop ordering destroyers because the fleet had more than it could crew. This was not quite true, but it captured the overwhelming nature of American production. Liberty ships, the cargo vessels that carried supplies across the Pacific, were built even faster. The average construction time dropped from 244 days early in the war to 42 days by 1943. One Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes as a demonstration of what American industry could achieve. Over 2,700 Liberty ships were built during the war. Japanese pilots who had dominated the skies over Pearl Harbor and the Philippines found themselves facing endless waves of new American aircraft. The Mitsubishi A6M0, the fighter that had terrorized Allied airmen in 1941 and 42, was designed for lightness and maneuverability. It could outclimb and outturn almost any opponent. Japanese pilots loved it. But the Zero achieved its agility by sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. A few hits from American guns would send a Zero down in flames. The pilots who survived learned to respect this vulnerability. The ones who did not learn did not survive. American designers took a different approach. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was heavier than the Zero, slower to climb, and less maneuverable in a turning fight, but it was faster in level flight and in a dive. It carried heavier armament, 650 caliber machine guns, instead of the Zero's 2 20mm cannon and 2 light machine guns. Most importantly, it protected its pilot with armor plate and surrounded the fuel tanks with self-sealing rubber that could absorb battle damage. American tactics emphasized these strengths. Hellcat pilots were taught never to dogfight with Zeros at low speed. Instead, they used their superior speed and dive performance to make slashing attacks, hit hard, and disengage before Japanese pilots could respond. The tactics were devastatingly effective. The Vought F-4U Corsair was even more formidable. Originally designed for carrier operations, it initially proved difficult to land on carrier decks, but Marine Corps squadrons based on island airfields adopted it enthusiastically. The Corsair was the fastest fighter in the Pacific, capable of over 400 miles per hour. Japanese pilots learned to fear its distinctive inverted gull-wing silhouette. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and twin tail booms, gave American pilots extended range and devastating firepower concentrated in the nose. It was P-38s that would eventually shoot down Admiral Yamamoto himself. But it was not just quality that overwhelmed Japan. It was quantity on a scale that defied comprehension. The United States produced over 300,000 military aircraft during World War II. Japan produced approximately 70,000. American factories turned out 5 combat aircraft for every one that Japan built, and American training programs graduated pilots at a rate that Japan could never match. When Japanese pilots were killed, they were replaced by hastily trained recruits with inadequate flight hours. When American pilots were killed, they were replaced by pilots who had received hundreds of hours of training in stateside programs that operated without fear of enemy attack. The disparity extended to every category of military equipment. American shipyards produced over 150 aircraft carriers of all types during the war. Japan produced 18. American factories produced 88,000 tanks. Japan produced fewer than 5,000. American arsenals turned out 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. Japanese production was a fraction of that amount. Emperor Hirohito himself began to notice the disparity. In late December 1942, as the battle for Guadalcanal raged, Hirohito questioned his military chiefs about why American forces seemed so much better equipped than his own. His generals and admirals explained the challenges of supply lines and logistics. But one exchange revealed the fundamental problem. Hirohito asked about the reports that Americans completed airfield construction in days, while Japanese engineers required over a month. His officers explained that Americans used machines to accomplish tasks that Japanese forces did by hand. American construction equipment could clear jungle and level ground at speeds that seemed impossible. The emperor reportedly fell silent. He understood what this meant. Japan was fighting a war of manpower against a nation of machines. The battle for Guadalcanal became a grinding war of attrition that Japan could not win. American forces had landed on August 7, 1942, just 2 months after Midway. They captured an unfinished Japanese airfield that construction crews had nearly completed on the northern coast of the island. American engineers finished the airfield in record time, laid down pierced steel planking over the dirt runway, and renamed it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway leading a dive bomber attack against Japanese carriers. Henderson Field became the pivot around which the entire battle revolved. Whoever controlled the airfield controlled the skies over Guadalcanal. Aircraft from Henderson Field could attack Japanese ships attempting to reinforce the island. Japanese commanders realized they had to destroy the airfield or abandon their position in the Solomon Islands. For 6 months, they tried everything. Navy ships clashed in the waters around Guadalcanal in a series of desperate night battles that became some of the most vicious naval combat of the war. Japanese commanders were skilled at night fighting, using their superior training in torpedo tactics and their deadly long-lance torpedoes. American ships often came off worse in these nighttime clashes. Both sides lost numerous vessels in what became known as Iron Bottom Sound for the number of ships that sank in its waters. The naval battle of Savo Island on August 8th and 9th was a catastrophe for the Allies. A Japanese cruiser force surprised the screening ships guarding the landing beaches and sank 4 heavy cruisers in less than an hour. The American ships, Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria, and the Australian ship Canberra. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died. It was the worst defeat in American naval history in a surface engagement, surpassed only by Pearl Harbor itself. But there was a crucial difference between Japanese and American losses. Every American ship that sank could be replaced. Every Japanese ship that sank was gone forever. American shipyards were already building replacement cruisers faster than they could be sunk. Japanese shipyards could not keep pace. The Tokyo Express, as Americans called the nightly Japanese destroyer, runs bringing reinforcements and supplies to Guadalcanal, demonstrated both Japanese determination and American growing dominance. Japanese destroyers would race down the slot, the channel between the Solomon Islands, at night, unload troops and supplies, and race back before dawn when American aircraft from Henderson Field would attack. It was a dangerous, desperate supply line that delivered men but rarely heavy equipment or sufficient food. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal suffered terribly. Cut off from adequate supply, they began to starve within weeks of the American landing. Their daily rice ration was cut repeatedly. They ate grass, roots, insects, and eventually each other. Tropical diseases killed thousands. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi swept through units that lacked medicine, clean water, and proper nutrition. Officers reported that their men were too weak to carry their rifles, let alone attack American positions defended by well-fed troops with plentiful ammunition. Japanese attacks on Henderson Field were brave but futile. Soldiers charged into American machine gun fire, threw themselves at barbed wire, and died in heaps before the Marine positions. The Ichiki detachment was annihilated in August. The Kawaguchi Brigade was shattered in September during the Battle of Bloody Ridge. Each attack was supposed to be the decisive assault that would destroy the American position. Each attack failed against firepower that seemed inexhaustible. By February 1943, Japan evacuated its surviving forces from Guadalcanal. Of the 36,000 Japanese troops committed to the campaign, over 20,000 were dead, and most of those deaths were from disease and starvation rather than combat. Many of the survivors were too weak to walk and had to be carried to the evacuation ships. American losses were approximately 1,600 killed in action, with thousands more wounded or struck down by tropical diseases. The pattern established at Guadalcanal would repeat across the Pacific for the next 2.5 years. Japan would defend an island with determination and courage. American forces would assault with overwhelming firepower and materiel. Japanese defenders would inflict casualties but ultimately be annihilated. And then the Americans would advance to the next island, bringing more ships, more planes, more men, and more equipment than before. The Japanese Navy attempted to reverse the tide at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. This was supposed to be the decisive battle that Japanese strategists had dreamed of since the war began. The Japanese assembled 9 carriers with over 500 aircraft. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa believed his pilots could defeat the Americans if given a chance to strike first. His carriers would launch from beyond American attack range, strike the enemy fleet, land on airfields in the Mariana Islands to refuel and rearm, then return to their carriers. It was an elegant plan that might have worked in 1942, but this was 1944. Instead of the weakened force Japan expected, they encountered Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher. It was the most powerful naval force in history up to that point. 15 American carriers, including 7 of the new Essex-class ships, launched over 900 aircraft. The American pilots were superbly trained. Many had combat experience from earlier campaigns. They flew aircraft that outperformed anything Japan could put in the air. The Japanese struck first, as Ozawa had planned, but American radar detected the incoming attack waves long before they reached the fleet. Hellcats scrambled to intercept, guided by fighter directors who could track both friend and foe on their radar screens. The result was a massacre. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American fighters, vectored onto Japanese formations by radar, tore through the attacking aircraft. Japanese pilots, many of them recent graduates with minimal flight training, flew in rigid formations that made them easy targets. They lacked the fuel to maneuver extensively. They lacked the experience to respond to American tactics. Over 350 Japanese aircraft were shot down on June 19th alone. American fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroyed wave after wave of attackers. Only a handful of Japanese aircraft reached the American fleet, and they scored only minor damage. American losses that day were approximately 30 aircraft. The next day, American aircraft found the Japanese fleet and attacked at extreme range near sunset. They sank the carrier Hyo and damaged several other ships. The return flight to American carriers in darkness was dangerous. Many pilots ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean, but rescue operations recovered most of the downed aircrews. Over 50 American aircraft were lost to fuel exhaustion. But only 16 pilots and 33 aircrew died. When the battle ended, Japan had lost 3 carriers, including Taiho, the newest and most advanced ship in the fleet, which exploded due to aviation fuel fumes. Over 600 aircraft were destroyed. More critically, Japan lost most of its remaining trained naval aviators. The men who died over the Philippine Sea could never be replaced. Japan no longer had time to train pilots properly, and the fuel for training flights was increasingly scarce. The Japanese carrier force was effectively finished as a fighting unit. It would sortie once more, at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, but only as a decoy force meant to draw American carriers away from the invasion beaches. The great carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor and conquered half the Pacific were reduced to empty hulks, offering themselves as bait. American pilots who participated in the Philippine Sea Battle expressed amazement at how easy it had been. The Japanese pilots they faced were nothing like the skilled veterans of 1941 and 42. These were hastily trained replacements who flew in predictable formations and fell quickly to American guns. One American pilot described it as shooting fish in a barrel. Another compared it to a training exercise. The days of feared Japanese air superiority were over. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 brought the war home to the Japanese government. Saipan was part of the Mariana Islands, and its capture meant that American B-29 bombers could now reach the Japanese home islands. Tokyo itself would be within range of American air attacks. The strategic implications were devastating. Japan's war planners had always assumed that the home islands would remain beyond the reach of enemy bombers. Now that assumption was shattered. The civilian population, already struggling with shortages, would face direct attack. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan into the war, resigned in disgrace. His government fell, replaced by leaders who privately understood that the war was lost but could not bring themselves to surrender. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the conqueror of Singapore, who was later known as the Tiger of Malaya, was transferred to command the defense of the Philippines. He understood perfectly well what he faced. The Americans had returned with overwhelming force, hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Yamashita fought a skillful defensive campaign, retreating into the mountains of Luzon and avoiding the decisive battle that American commanders sought. But he could not stop the American advance. His supply lines were cut, his ammunition dwindled, his soldiers starved in the jungle, while American troops received regular rations, mail from home, and even ice cream. After the war, Yamashita was tried for war crimes in Manila. The proceedings revealed the impossible situation he had faced. American attacks had destroyed his communications networks. He could not coordinate his scattered forces because he lacked radios, vehicles, and even reliable messenger services. Japanese commanders throughout the Philippines had been isolated, unable to receive orders or report on their situations. The American forces, by contrast, seemed to possess unlimited resources. They could bombard Japanese positions for hours before attacking. They could call in airstrikes at will. They could bring up tanks, artillery, and fresh infantry whenever needed. Japanese soldiers who survived American assaults described walls of fire that seemed impossible to penetrate. The final year of the war brought suffering to Japan on a scale that even Yamamoto had not imagined. American B-29 bombers, flying from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, began systematic attacks on Japanese cities in November 1944. At first, these were precision raids aimed at aircraft factories and industrial facilities, but poor weather and the limitations of high-altitude bombing produced disappointing results. In March 1945, the strategy changed. General Curtis LeMay ordered low-altitude incendiary raids against Japanese urban areas. On the night of March 9th and 10th, over 300 B-29s attacked Tokyo with incendiary bombs. The resulting firestorm killed approximately 100,000 people, destroyed 16 square miles of the city, and left over 1 million homeless. It was the deadliest air raid in human history. And it was just the beginning. Over the following months, American bombers burned city after city. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities were reduced to ashes. Japan's industrial capacity, already strained, collapsed. Factory workers fled to the countryside. Raw materials could not reach assembly lines. Production of aircraft, ammunition, and equipment fell catastrophically. By summer 1945, American bombers had run out of major cities to burn. They began attacking smaller towns, warning residents with leaflets before raids. The Japanese air defense system, once formidable, had been destroyed. American bombers flew with near impunity over the home islands. The Japanese response was kamikaze attacks, suicide strikes by pilots who deliberately crashed their aircraft into American ships. These attacks began during the Philippines campaign and intensified during the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Thousands of young Japanese men volunteered to die, flying obsolete aircraft on one-way missions against the American fleet. The kamikaze attacks caused significant American casualties. At Okinawa, suicide planes sank 26 American ships and damaged over 200 more. But they could not change the outcome of the war. For every kamikaze pilot who reached his target, more were shot down by American fighters and anti-aircraft guns, and the flow of American ships seemed endless. Japanese commanders who survived the war described their astonishment at American resilience. Ships that would have crippled any other navy were repaired and returned to combat within weeks. Losses that would have forced other nations to negotiate were absorbed without hesitation. The Americans kept coming, wave after wave, until there was nothing left to defend. The invasion of Okinawa in April 1945 demonstrated the full weight of American power. The assault force included over 1,300 ships and over 180,000 soldiers, sailors, and Marines. It was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Japanese defenders fought with their customary determination. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers died defending the island. But American firepower was overwhelming. Naval gunfire support ships could deliver more explosive power in a single day than the entire Japanese Navy possessed. Carrier aircraft attacked at will, having destroyed the remnants of Japanese air power. The battle for Okinawa lasted nearly 3 months and cost over 12,000 American lives, with total casualties approaching 50,000 when including the wounded. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000. Civilian casualties on the island may have reached 100,000 more, including many who committed suicide rather than surrender. By summer 1945, Japan was utterly defeated, but had not surrendered. American military planners prepared for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. They estimated over 1 million American casualties and possibly 10 million Japanese deaths. The fighting would make Okinawa look minor by comparison. But another demonstration of American industrial and scientific power was coming. Since 1942, the United States had been working on a secret project code named Manhattan. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers labored at sites across the country. Los Alamos in New Mexico, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington. They were building the most destructive weapon in human history, and Japan had no equivalent program. The atomic bomb project cost approximately $2 billion, the equivalent of over $30 billion today. It employed over 125,000 people at its peak. It consumed more electricity than some small countries. It represented an industrial and scientific effort that no other nation on Earth could have mounted during wartime. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped an atomic bomb called Little Boy on Hiroshima. The weapon detonated at 8:15 in the morning local time, approximately 1,900 feet above the city. The explosion killed approximately 80,000 people instantly. A fireball hotter than the surface of the sun vaporized everything within a half-mile radius. The blast wave demolished buildings up to a mile away. Fires swept through the wreckage, driven by the tremendous heat. Within hours, a black rain containing radioactive particles fell on the devastated city. By the end of 1945, the death toll would reach approximately 140,000 as victims succumbed to burns, radiation, sickness, and injuries. Japanese leaders were stunned but did not immediately surrender. Some believed it must have been a freak accident or perhaps a natural disaster. Others suspected a new weapon but doubted America could have more than one. The Supreme Council met but could not reach agreement on how to respond. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Fat Man, a plutonium implosion device, different in design from the Hiroshima bomb, detonated over Nagasaki at 11:02 in the morning on August 9th. The city's hilly terrain limited the damage compared to flat Hiroshima, but approximately 40,000 people died immediately, with the final toll reaching over 70,000. These weapons represented something unprecedented in human history: the ability to destroy an entire city with a single bomb carried by a single aircraft. and the fact that America possessed them while Japan did not illustrated the ultimate disparity between the two nations. American industry, American science, American resources had produced weapons that Japan could not even imagine, let alone build. Some Japanese military leaders wanted to continue fighting even after Nagasaki. They argued that Japan still had millions of soldiers under arms. They insisted that the Americans could not have many atomic bombs. They urged preparations for a final, suicidal defense of the homeland. Emperor Hirohito intervened personally to end the war. In an unprecedented move, he attended an imperial conference near midnight on August 9th and declared his support for accepting the Allied surrender terms. On August 14th, the Council accepted. On August 15th, 1945, Hirohito's recorded voice was broadcast to the Japanese people for the first time in history. The emperor did not use the word surrender. Japanese officials could not bring themselves to speak so directly. Instead, Hirohito said that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He announced that Japan had decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. The meaning was clear despite the euphemisms. Japan had lost. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri, the formal surrender was signed. General MacArthur presided. Representatives of Japan signed documents accepting complete defeat. Around the Missouri, those 300 ships and 900 aircraft displayed the power that had destroyed the Japanese Empire. It was a visual demonstration of everything Yamamoto had predicted and his colleagues had refused to believe. In the years after the war, surviving Japanese commanders were interrogated by American officers seeking to understand the conflict from the enemy's perspective. These interviews, conducted under the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and other intelligence programs, revealed that many Japanese leaders had known from the beginning that their cause was hopeless. They had fought anyway, some out of loyalty, some out of honor, and some because they could not imagine any other course. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, was among those interrogated. Fuchida had shouted, "Tora, Tora, Tora," the code word meaning tiger, 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 confirming that surprise had been achieved over Hawaii. He had circled above Pearl Harbor watching American battleships burn and had thought he was witnessing Japanese triumph. He had survived the war despite participating in most of its major battles, one of the few Japanese aviators to do so. Fuchida told his American interrogators that Japan had never had a realistic chance of winning. The attack on Pearl Harbor, he argued, had been a strategic mistake. It had awakened American fury without crippling American power. The carriers that escaped would have been far more valuable targets than the old battleships that were sunk. Later historians have questioned some details in Fuchida's accounts, as his recollections sometimes differed from other eyewitnesses. But the overall assessment that Japan had fundamentally underestimated American resolve and industrial capacity was shared by numerous Japanese officers who survived the war. When asked about American firepower, Fuchida described the shock Japanese pilots felt as the war progressed. In 1941, Japanese aircraft and pilots were superior to anything the Americans could put in the air. Japanese training was rigorous, producing superb aviators. Japanese aircraft were designed for the specific demands of Pacific warfare. The Zero fighter was the finest carrier aircraft in the world. But by 1943, the equation had changed. American aircraft were better designed, more heavily armed, and more rugged in combat. By 1944, American pilots were far more numerous and increasingly experienced. The Japanese pilots who had dominated the early battles were dead, killed over Midway and the Solomons and a dozen other battlefields. Their replacements were novices who could not match American training because Japan lacked the fuel and the time to train them properly. Fuchida recalled missions in the later war years where Japanese formations were intercepted by swarms of American fighters before they could even reach their targets. Pilots who had survived dozens of missions in 1942 were shot down on their first mission in 1944. The Americans seemed to know where the Japanese were going and what they intended to do. Fuchida did not know about American code breaking, but he understood that Japanese pilots had lost the technological and tactical superiority they once possessed.